when they're able to come to our store here, which is a locally owned store, and then buy some locally grown cannabis, it really helps them feel like they're contributing back to our community.
He made sure he had chairs for us on the monitor. We're watching Neil Young and killing it to 90,000 people in Denmark. And then during their encore, he whispers and he calls us behind the curtain.
Stop.
That's when he has a joint for all of us.
I'm a really firm believer that cannabis will turn into wine. I believe that once cannabis is able to grow in the same regions that, you know, the soil that grapes are grown in, that we're going to have some really beautiful stuff in the future.
It's Reefer Madness, the podcast with Trevor and Kirk.
Kirk, you're back.
Hey, Trevor, how's it going?
I'm doing well. For those of you following at home, this is the first time I've talked with Kirk on a podcast since he's been back from all over Africa, Europe, the Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean.
Don't blow it up. I went to Morocco and Spain. Yeah, we Michelle and I were gone for
whole African continent.
The whole continent, yeah, that whole northeast, northwestern tip. No, we were gone for 7 weeks, I think. We left in August and got back in the second week of October. And yeah, I gathered a whole bunch of stories. I think we were just talking, I think I got 5 to 6 stories about what's happening in Morocco and what's happening in Spain, and fascinating stuff. So we were just discussing how we're hoping to produce those in the next little while. So I think it's going to be an autumn.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. I think we're going to have an autumn of travel stories, road stories from Morocco and Spain.
Can't wait. But today we are going to talk about what can be dull, but I think we both agreed ended up being really interesting, epidemiology.
Yeah.
So everybody loves, statistics, and let's talk about large numbers of people, but this one really was cool. So I think I said it in the thing, but I'll repeat the title because it's long, but it kind of goes what we're talking about: gender differences in cannabis outcomes after recreational legalization, a United States repeated cross-sectional study, 2008 to 2017. Okay, not a short title, but it was interesting.
I found it in Normal. I think I found this story in Normal. And I found lots of stories in Normal, and I think I've told the audience this, that I get Normal pushed to me. I think, I don't even think once a week or once a month. I don't even know how often it comes. But I read through Normal, and I find stories, and I would safely say 70% of the normals that I read, I send out requests for podcast interviews, and I get back probably 10% of them. And then out of that 10%, we usually gravitate 5 of that usually happens, and this is one of them. And they got back to me as I was leaving for Spain, and I punted it to you and said, "Hey man, this is an interview we should be doing," and I'm so pleased we got it.
Yeah, me too. So we have Luis and Silvia. So we'll let them go into the crux of what they did, but just kind of an overview. They looked at this huge health survey that goes out all the time in the US, and they focused on 2008 to 2017, and we'll let them do the details, but I want to, because we talked about this just before coming on air, I want to talk about, I'm going to call it a natural experiment. I'm stealing that term from the economists out there just because I think it covers this well. So in my world, pharmacist, we want a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, right? We want half the people to get the drug of interest and half the people to get a sugar pill, no one to know who got what, and see what effect it had. That's our sort of gold standard. But in the real world, it can be really hard to do that. It might not be possible to have a placebo control. It might not be ethical. So, if you want to see what effect seatbelts had on deaths after car accidents, you might get lucky for deaths in car accidents, where, one province says seatbelts are mandatory this year, and the next province does it the year after, and you can sort of see the difference. They can work as their own control. That's sort of a natural experiment. One of the famous ones I like talking about, and it's not just because I like the book and podcast for economics, but Steve Levitt, an economist and a co-author, looked at some stuff in the early 70s. In the early 70s, Roe versus Wade in the U.S. About abortion came on, but states legalized abortion at different times. So, the Supreme Court thing came in, and then different states in different years made abortion legal. And so they used that natural experiment thing to look at about 20 years later. So that happened in the early 70s. So they looked in the early 90s to see what was happening to crime rates. And what they found is basically crime rates fell about 20 years-ish after abortion was legalized. Now, I'm not saying I'm pro or against abortion, neither were them. That's not this podcast, save your hate mail, but it was interesting because, you can't ethically or even possibly saying, this group of people is allowed to have abortions and this group isn't. But when you find this happening sort of quote unquote naturally, it can give you some useful information. So that's what these guys were doing in this is different states in this period of time, 2008 to 2017, went from medically legal to recreationally legal, and that's what they were looking at.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. So basically some numbers here. As of November 2023, 38 American states, including Washington, D.C., had legalized cannabis for medical use. And then by that time, 24 of those states and Washington, D.C. legalized for recreational use. So what they were able to do was to look at how people consumed cannabis between those states. So they got down to, I think they got down to 9 states that they actually focused on. And then
that changed during that time period.
That's right, yeah, during that time period. And they looked at 838,600 surveys were done with experienced survey interviewers who interviewed people about this, and they were able to do a cross-sectional study on how people changed their use in cannabis compared to the medical states to the recreational states, right? And so I think, and I mean, I'm hypothesizing on this, I think they got their funding because we're going to let them introduce themselves, but they're both focused on addictions, right? They're both health professionals, academics.
Substance use.
Yeah, but academic use and how people use substances, which is usually, it's usually misuse is involved in that, right? They're usually looking at misuse. So I think that they did this study, got the funding with an expectation that they didn't necessarily find. So I think they asked a question.
I think that's fair.
And so as an academic, when I was doing my master's, you ask a question and that's the biggest thing about, PhD students and any master graduate student is people always say, so what's your question? What's your question? What are you researching? And I think they asked the question and they got a different result. And so you want to just go right into it and we can come out and discuss the results?
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's listen to Luis and Silvia and we'll talk a little more on the way up.
Fantastic.
On the line today, we have Luis and Silvia from New York, and they are part of an interesting study on cannabis use and gender. I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. Luis, I'm going to start with you.
Hi, I am Luis Segura. I am a postdoctoral research scientist at the Department of Epidemiology, working at the Substance Use Epidemiology Unit. I got my PhD from Columbia University. I'm also an MD by training from Mexico. And mainly the work that I do focuses on the impact of cannabis and other drug use policies on substance use and substance use disorders.
Thank you very much. And Silvia.
Hello, I'm Silva Martins. I'm a professor of epidemiology, director of the Substance Use Epidemiology Unit at the Department of Epidemiology at Columbia University. I'm also the vice dean for faculty at the school, and I lead the team that does work on cannabis and opioid policies and other substance use policies and social policies on multiple substance use outcomes.
Thank you very much. So it said at least once, I'll read the title. So, Gender Differences in Cannabis Outcomes After Recreational Legalization, a United States Repeated Cross-Sectional Study, 2008 to 2017. And whoever wants to jump in. So the first is is this fair to call this a natural experiment? An experiment where we're sort of, where it'd be unethical or impractical to, put people in, study groups and placebo groups, but we could just kind of watch something happen. Like, famous example would be, you watch to see what happens to deaths after seatbelt laws come into place. That's the kind of study we're looking at here, right?
Yes, correct. I think this can be classified as a quasi-experimental design, and we use a design similar to difference in difference, which is pretty common to use when you have your outcome is already that you don't have a time without the outcome. So the outcome is present when the policy happens, and then you need to see how that outcome changes after the policy is implemented.
Oh, sounds good. Okay, so either one of you, what were you looking for? And then we'll sort of get into how you set this up. So what were you interested in finding out at the beginning of this?
So at the beginning of this, we were interested in looking at whether there were changes in the prevalence of cannabis use. So past year, past month, daily use and cannabis use disorder across time after the enactment of recreational cannabis laws. And specifically, this is part of a larger body of research. And specifically in this paper, we were interested in seeing like if there were changes and if the changes were different across genders. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe Luis, you on this one. So what sort of body of data were you looking at to try to figure this out?
Yes, of course. So we use restricted access data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health from 2018 to 2017. So these are panels of cross-sectionals that happened throughout that time period and allowed us to identify respondents, whether they reside in a recreational cannabis laws state, and their cannabis use in the past month, past year, whether they were daily users, and if they had a cannabis use disorder according to the DSM.
Okay. And the other thing I noticed is it ended up being 9 states, just that's sort of what happened in your time frame. So you were sort of looking at, did they have a recreational cannabis law? Did they have a medical cannabis law? And sort of when it switched from one to the other, sort of during this time period?
Yes, and just to clarify, like we used all U.S. states in the analysis, but there were only 9 states that switched from like medical cannabis to recreational cannabis. So that was our contrast of interest, looking specifically at those that switched. But we included all the other states, all the other states in the analysis. And I think it's important to say that in the U.S., all states that have enacted and passed recreational cannabis laws were states where already medical cannabis had been already legalized in the past. I don't know, Luis, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that it is important also to know that medical cannabis laws had already showed some effect on cannabis use. So the idea of focusing on the switching between enacting recreational cannabis laws in states that had already passed medical cannabis laws, which were all states that passed recreational, was to hold constant the effect on the trend in cannabis use. So it was important to include the states that only had medical cannabis laws to adjust for that trend in the use of cannabis and the other cannabis outcomes that we looked at, and also for states that were very different, but also where cannabis use has a certain trend, which are states that did not pass anything.
Okay. And just because it's right there in the title, were you interested in gender from the beginning, or was it just something that sort of popped out as you were doing the study?
think we were interested on gender from the beginning. So from the beginning, because we had seen that was based upon like research done with medical cannabis laws and studies done like looking at trends over time in cannabis use that showed like gender differences. So that's why like we've been interested not just like in looking at changes in the general population, but also by gender and by age groups, because we know that we thought there would be we would see different changes. Yeah.
Okay. And just because, math is hard to do over a podcast, we're not going to get too deep into the stats here, but either one of you, do you want to give us just sort of the high level of how you did this and what you were looking at, and then we'll finally get around to the results of what came out the other end?
Yeah, of course. So I think at the time, this was also a very interesting analysis to do because at the time, the way of doing this difference in differences, when you have policies that are enacted at different time points, represented a challenge, right? So usually in a normal experiment, what most people are used to, you have people without the outcome, right? You assign an intervention or an exposure, and then after a certain period of time, you evaluate whether or not they have the outcome. However, in this kind of quasi-experimental designs, you have people that already have the outcome, right? And then an intervention happened, and what you want to see is whether the outcome shifted from the trajectory that they had before the policy intervention. However, at the time, methods for evaluating this were based on a fixed time of when the intervention happened. So when you have an intervention that happens at one time point for some individuals, and then at another time, at a later time period happens for other individuals, and so on, then the analysis and the math becomes a little bit more challenging, right? So what our study did was that we implemented a time-varying exposure of when the recreational cannabis laws enacted. So at every time point, we have a indicator of these recreational cannabis laws that change for some individuals. So change or gets activated. So we know that they were actually exposed. And what we did then was to compare, right, their cannabis outcome when these laws were enacted, compared to those that were not residing in the state that the recreational cannabis laws were enacted, and we adjusted for the previous trend in the outcome, right? So we can see just the bump above and beyond the trajectory that they had on their cannabis use.
Okay. All right. So I think we've got this set up nicely. So we've done this. We've like Silvia was saying, we looked at the whole U.S. and we were kind of using and jump in if I'm saying this wrong. So we're kind of using some of the states that didn't have recreational cannabis laws almost as controls for the ones that did. And we got some results based on gender and age. So what sort of popped out the other end of this?
So interestingly, what we saw is that overall, we saw increases in past year cannabis use among both men and women. We also saw some increases in past month cannabis use, but we didn't see increases in past month daily cannabis use or DSM-5 cannabis use disorder. And Luis, do you want to add like the results by age and gender?
Before you do that, because I probably should have asked. So just for the audience, just real quick, what do we mean by past month use, past daily use, and you don't have to go through all the criteria, but what sort of things were we looking at to indicate someone had cannabis use disorder?
Oh, yes, sure. So past year use is people self-reporting whether they used cannabis at least once in the past year. So it could have been like used, let's say, at a party, used at friends, but at least once. Past month is people self-reporting that they used cannabis at least once in the past month. Daily use, we use a classification where people reported that they used cannabis at least 20 days in the past month. So almost every day. And that is consistent with what others have done in other studies. And cannabis use disorder is whether people in this survey, people are asked several questions that match on to like the DSM-5, the DSM-4 criteria, So whether they are having problems with their cannabis use, reporting withdrawal, tolerance, or uh, problems with their family, problems in work, spending a lot of time looking for cannabis. So if they meet criteria for a certain number of those questions, then they could, in theory, potentially have a cannabis use disorder. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, and thank you, Luis. So, what were we finding out when some of these age stratification, gender stratifications came out?
Right. So in general, we found that men and women age 20 to 21 to 30 years old, their past year and past month cannabis use increased more than the other age groups. They were the age bracket that showed a higher increase in past month and past year cannabis use. However, their daily cannabis use, so how frequent they were using, and their cannabis use disorder did not increase in any of the different age brackets that we looked at, which were 12 to 20, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, and 40 and plus, either for men and women. So those show no significant increases. One of the main concerns about these policies is whether or not they affect the use of adolescents and young adults, right? So people age 12 to 20, which we did evaluate whether their cannabis use increased. We found that it did not increase for men or for women. In fact, past year cannabis use decreased a little among men aged 12 to 20, and their past month cannabis use did not change.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Now, to just probably restate what you're saying, but just again, jump if I'm getting something wrong. So the first thing you said, anecdotally, doesn't surprise me. After cannabis becomes recreational in a state, people aged 20 to 30-ish, male or female, are more likely to have a joint at a party than they were before legalization. Not that surprising anecdotally, but like you said, something everybody's concerned about is after we get recreational legalization, do teenagers use cannabis more? And you're finding no, and even decreases in teenage boys in cannabis use. Do I have that right?
Correct. Small decreases. However, the concern is always that these policies will increase, right? That's the main concern, that all these, and like you said, is not surprising, right? Because cannabis policies, they are making these products legal for adults. Right. So the concern is whether there's spillovers to other age groups that they are not meant to be impacted by these policies. So, for example, adolescents and young boys. Right. The other thing that was also that we evaluated and we were very interested is this concept of the cannabis gender gap. Right. Historically, and is very well known that men use more cannabis than women. Right, because of their perception or maybe the risk-taking behavior, or we are not entirely sure, but it seems that on every other, or research has shown that in general, women tend to have more liberal views about most things, like gun control and other policies. They are more supportive. Or like government regulation than men. However, in the case of cannabis, they tend to be more more conservative, or they tend to engage less with use of cannabis historically. So there's a gap between the use of men and women. So we were interested in evaluating whether this, because making cannabis more accessible, right, with legalization, whether that changed that gap between men and women in cannabis use. So even though men start at a higher level of use than women, we saw that the increase for both men and women after legalization was higher for women than men, decreasing that gender gap.
And that is interesting. Yeah, again, anecdotally, you guys have done the research, but anecdotally, yes, cannabis has sort of been seen as a male-dominated space, something that young boys and men were interested in and women not. So it is interesting to see that legalization, I know maybe I'm reading too much into this, but seems to make it more acceptable. Women find it less inaccessible, less stigmatizing, less something that it's now something they're more interested in trying or using.
Yes, I think it's exactly that. Like once it's less stigmatizing, more acceptable, like we see like this greater increase in women. Yeah.
Okay, and something else, and you touched on, but I think it's just worth spending a little bit of time with. When we have recreational cannabis laws come into effect, we talked about teenagers already, but the other big thing is everybody now going to have a problem with cannabis? Is everyone now going to have cannabis use disorder? And that is not what you found, correct?
Correct. Correct. That is not what we found. Of course, like we should, there is a caveat that we analyzed data up until 2017, and during that time period, like only 9 states switched to having recreational cannabis laws, but I think it is also at the same time like encouraging to see that even though more people are reporting cannabis use, we weren't seeing like increases in cannabis use disorder. But of course that could take time, and we need like to continue following up, especially now that more U.S. states have legalized, to see if there is or if this trend continues, or if there is a shift also in this outcome.
Right. If I may add also, and that is a very important limitation, right? That cannabis use disorder takes time to develop, right? But the other also, I guess, strength of what we did, and that supports the notion that these laws are not increasing people's cannabis use disorder, is that other studies have shown that cannabis use disorder has increased in the overall population after enactment of cannabis laws. But there's a caveat to that, to analyzing the data that way, right? Because cannabis use, recreational and cannabis policies are increasing the number of users. So they're increasing the pool of people that use cannabis. So yes, of course, you're going to have a bigger proportion of people that endorse cannabis use disorder eventually. However, when you look at people that are users of cannabis, whether or not they are having higher proportion of cannabis use disorder, we found that that is not the case after enactment of recreational cannabis law. So those are people that are at risk of developing cannabis use disorder, right? So which suggests, right, that these laws are increasing the pool of people that are using cannabis, yes, of course, but they don't seem to be increasing the frequency or the intensity by which cannabis users are using cannabis. So that is, I think, in support of these laws not increasing cannabis use disorder.
Well, that's great. And just again to restate and jump in if I'm not getting this right, but so as the number of people who use cannabis go up, not surprisingly, the absolute number of people with cannabis use disorder is going to go up, but the recreational use laws, the increase does not seem to increase the rate or the proportion or the percentage of people that have a cannabis use disorder.
Correct. Yes.
That's good to know. Obviously, we're a pro-cannabis podcast, and other people may be much more upset by the fact that the absolute number is going up, and we're not trying to dismiss that. Was there anything else sort of surprising that came out of the numbers that you really went, wow, I didn't expect that, or I better recheck my math, or that was weird, and anything else sort of pop out at you from the study?
I think that we were very surprised by the narrowing of the cannabis gender gap. I think we were. Our prior was that, or our prior belief was that, the cannabis gender gap was gonna stay the same. But it does seem that there is some effect on individuals, particularly women, perception of how risky it is to engage with cannabis use after enactment of these laws, or maybe what is changing is their perception of availability, or both. There are studies that look at both perception of availability and perception of risk of using cannabis, and how this has changed over time, probably due to the enactment of these laws and making cannabis less stigmatizing. And there's also this belief or idea that cannabis legalization can also help more social equity outcomes to advance them, because it changes how people perceive the risk associated with cannabis use. For example, whether or not that is a criminal offense that needs to be approached in a more harder way, right? Or how it changes how society engage and these gender norms. So we thought that was very interesting. I personally had a prior that I didn't think it was going to change much, but we were very surprised by seeing this cannabis gender gap narrow.
Well, that's the good part.
Yeah, I think another thing that we were surprised is that even though we weren't surprised that there weren't increases like in the adolescent population, so the population ages 12 to 20, we were somewhat surprised that there were decreases in the prevalence in the prevalence of past year cannabis use among boys. Yeah, so we were expecting that there might not be increases, but we weren't expecting also like to see a decrease. Yeah, so I think all of that is part of the same larger picture. Yeah,
that's very cool. And the whole point of research is to be surprised. So I'm glad we got some surprising things. So this is my usual time of saying, did I miss anything? Was there anything else you were expecting? Anything else you think our listeners need to know about cannabis use, gender gaps, age stratification, the study in general, where you're going in the future? Anything else that we need to know about this one?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the limitations that Dr. Martins already talked about, which is to see at future time points if cannabis use disorder have had time to develop, and if this actually increase is an important thing to replicate in the future. That's a future direction. Also, to clarify for the listeners, all these hypothetical mechanisms by which cannabis use increase more among women than men are just that, are hypotheses based on what other people have found in the literature. We just found that the cannabis gender gap narrow. So future studies should look at these mechanisms, right? So these mediating mechanisms by which use increase, whether it is changing in gender norms or increased perception of availability, or increased perception of decreased perception of risk of using cannabis. So I think that's another interesting avenue for future research. I don't know if you want to add something, Silvia.
I think one thing to point out, are also some of the limitations of the study. This is a national survey, and we only have information on self-report. So we don't have any information now the survey is collecting data on modes of cannabis use, but at the time we didn't have information on modes of cannabis use, and we also don't have information like on the THC content of the cannabis products that the people are using. So that's also an avenue for future research.
Right.
Those
and
are
I think
both fascinating. Sorry, Luis, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. Of course, I think that also another important component of any policy, right, is how they vary under different provisions, right? So future studies should look at how different provisions or different stipulations of these policies have differential effects or can affect differently cannabis use, right? Whether the policy increases the number of legal dispensaries or allows cultivation, or are there different consumption restrictions in different states, right? Those are things that definitely should be explored and see how they affect cannabis use and whether or not that affects also the cannabis gender gap. And of course, like I said before at the time, the evaluation of an intervention that has an staggered adoption approach was limited. Now, because we do a lot of policy evaluation, we know that there are more developed methods that it will be interesting to replicate these findings and see if they hold, right?
This was really good. I really appreciate your time, and this was great. We learned a lot, and for me, especially the whole cannabis legalization doesn't seem to affect teenagers, I think is a huge takeaway that I think everybody should know about.
Thank you for inviting us.
So Kirk, let's hit some highlights. I'm going to talk about my favorite highlight, statistically significant, not important or not. Teenage boys were using less cannabis post-legalization than pre-legalization. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's astounding. And I mean, looking at what happened in Canada legalized October 18th, 7 years ago, and the big, the sky's going to fall, kids are going to consume cannabis. Well, cannabis is not being consumed by a lot of people like kids. The kids aren't doing it. They're not drinking alcohol and they're not consuming cannabis as the thought was going to happen. I mean, kids are using cannabis. Kids have been using cannabis since the 30s, for crying out loud. But however, the big numbers didn't jump. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting number. That boys are using it less. So I guess because it's legal, it's less cool. I don't know. But I was thinking,
and go ahead.
Well, I was thinking that we should talk a little bit about what the DSM says about cannabis disorder, because a lot of this.
But no, that's good. Before you do, because they did mention it, but I think it's worth highlighting. Remember, they can't actually diagnose anybody with cannabis use disorder in a survey. So this was people who answered the question as if they might have cannabis use disorder, but it's different from you physically going and seeing a doctor, nurse practitioner and getting a diagnosis. But yeah, so no one got diagnosed, but showed tendencies towards. So, okay, go ahead. Tell us what the DSM-4 is saying.
Yeah, so when we look at the DSM, which is, DSM stands for
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
Yes, and this is where we diagnose psychological issues. This was a revelation for me a few years ago when I was managing a psych floor, and I had to look through the DSM and learn about what the DSM was. That was because I was never a psych nurse, so I was more of an emergency paramedic type guy. But I had to learn about DSMs because I was managing a floor. Anyways, that's a different story too. So people were interviewed, and what they're looking at here now, again, these are tendencies, these are behaviors. One of them is cannabis is taken in large amounts or used over a long period of time more than intended. Persistent desire to cut down with unsuccessful attempts. Excessive time spent acquiring cannabis, using cannabis, or recovering from its effect. Craving for cannabis. Recurrent use resulting in neglect of social obligations. Continued use despite social or interpersonal problems. Important social occupational or recreational activities foregone so that you can use your cannabis, continued use despite physical harm, continued use despite physical or psychological problems associated with the cannabis use, your tolerance level goes up, and you get withdrawal symptoms from using cannabis. Essentially, I think you can plug in any behavior and come up with this disorder, and just plug in cannabis. If you were using any substance that basically takes you away from your social or your occupational responsibilities, then you might have a problem. And I guess the terminology I like to use is, as opposed to blaming the individual, you just talk about behaviors. And behaviors is you're misusing cannabis, and you're misusing cannabis in such a way that it harms you to progress in life, if that's a better way of saying it. And again, define progressing in life. Individuals are individuals. But so that's how the DSM diagnoses you or gives you a label that you misuse cannabis. So in this study, they were able to look at those behaviors and see if by legalizing a state, do those behaviors materialize? So they were actually talking to people that had cannabis experience. And now that you live in a recreational state, has your cannabis experience changed? And what did they discover, Trevor?
The rate didn't go up. So, yeah. So see if I get this right, and jump in if I'm getting this saying it a little backwards. So, during legalization, more people are using cannabis, so there will now be more people who have cannabis use disorder, but it's not so I'm going to completely make up some percentages, but just let's say 10% of the population has cannabis use disorder. But after legalization, even though the number of people who use cannabis goes up, it's not like it goes from 10% to 50%. The percentage doesn't go up.
What they have here, and I sort of cut and pasted out of the study, they were looking at within the last month. So their questions that they had on their like card scored was, within the past month have. So the past month daily consumption use and past year DSM-5 among people that use cannabis did not increase after recreational cannabis laws. Legislation for women or men of any age, nothing went up for any age. So recognized cannabis use disorder takes time. So they recognize that one of the flaws of the study is that to diagnose somebody with recreational cannabis disorder takes some time. But legalization did not increase the number of cannabis use disorders anywhere. The limitation of the study is that it was short timelines. Laws increased the pool of users. So, the more the laws, there are more users to talk to about, because there was a small increase. Men and women did increase their use from the ages of 21 to 30. There was a small increase.
Right. And that's in my mind anyway, that's not unexpected. People, I think, drink more, use cannabis more, probably use other illicit drugs more, kind of between the age of 20 and 30. That when they become more available, honestly, that's not surprising to me. And that's kind of what they found there. But the one, and it's right in their title, the gender differences. I did think it was interesting that more women relative to men, they didn't catch up or anything. There's still a gap between the number of men and women who use cannabis, but more women relative to men were using cannabis post-legalization than pre-legalization. The why, we of course don't know, but they were speculating, and I thought makes sense to me. The speculation was because there's now less stigma after it's legalized, then women feel it's more acceptable for them to try cannabis. I thought that was a cool thing.
I guess I should have fact-checked myself here. But I think there's a study I read about women. First of all, women are more in touch with medical issues about themselves than men are. Women go to more medical assessments, more see doctors more regularly, obviously. Yeah. But also, I think women use medical cannabis more than men do. I think women, and this is going back a few years. Remember when we first started this podcast, we did a thing with SheCan. and they were talking about this. So women tend to report more about medical issues than men do. So maybe that was part of the factors involved with this. Some other things about this study. Increase past year cannabis use increased after recreational cannabis law enacted in women and men aged 21 and over, with higher increases among those aged 21 to 30. The decrease was in boys and men between 12 and 20. That was amazing. And what else was there? An experience or decrease in the past year from 24. Like, it wasn't significant, but it was enough to say that the legalization of cannabis has not sent our culture into a tailspin, essentially. And now this is an American study. There are some limitations to this study. Although they looked at America at a whole, they only really did focus on 9 states, but then those 9 states fell in within their parameters.
They looked at all 50, but those are the 9 states that changed from that were medically legal, became recreational legal during that time frame.
So some could argue it's a small study, but really it's not. It's a large study. It's also one of the other concerns about this study. Again, quantitative versus qualitative, because it was a self-reported study. Some academics will say that the study is flawed because people self-report. However, it depends on how you're looking at social science versus hard science, and it's made of the use in and what other things they didn't discuss was what type of cannabis are you using versus flower versus concentrates, but Essentially, for me as a cannabis advocate, this study, I'm so pleased to have it in our library, because this study once again says, guys, there's no evidence that suggests cannabis is harming society. And here's a study that suggests that cannabis legalization isn't harming us.
No, I agree. That was my big takeaway too, is, the sky didn't fall. I said on our previous interview with our local radio station around the anniversary of cannabis legalization, in a way, cannabis legalization in Canada was a bit of a nothing burger. Like, nothing too exciting happened post-legalization. There weren't suddenly a bunch of car crashes. There weren't suddenly a bunch of kids, high all day in math class. There weren't, the sky did not fall. Cannabis legalization happened and nothing happened. Nothing untoward happened.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, we've added to our coffers like $20 billion annually to the coffers, and in a restricted industry. So I think this is another tool in the toolbox to say to people, relax. Alcohol still does more harm to our culture than cannabis does.
No, I agree. Anything else interesting we need to talk about on this one?
No, I'm just very pleased we got this in our library. Like I said, when I read this study on normal, I said I got to get these guys. I got to go back in my sent file on my emails and review some of over the last 3 years how many requests for interviews I've sent out because I've read normal articles. So yeah, this is a good one.
Yeah,
another good one.
Or normals should just pay us a royalty fee for keep promoting them on our podcast. But that's another discussion for another day. I'm Trevor Schufeld. I'm the pharmacist. This has been Reefer Madness, the podcast. Find everything Reefer Madness related on our website, reefermed.ca, or on all your podcasting platforms. And on most of the social medias, we are at Reefer Madness.
Yes, Reefer Madness, the podcast. I'm Kirk Nyquist. I'm the registered nurse. I spend a lot of time on our webpage. And I want to just let people know, I push you to our webpage because on our webpage, you can link to Spotify, you can link to iTunes, or you can just listen to our podcast on our webpage because the YouTube channel is there. We subscribe to Blueberry, so when you click on our podcast on the webpage, you are actually listening to it and giving us statistics. So if you go to Spotify, it still goes back to Blueberry. I mean, so just go to our webpage. The other reason why I suggest you go to our webpage, I'm meeting people on the streets, actually. I've been home for about a week now and wandering around, and people stop me saying, hey, I heard you were away. I heard you were away. A couple people actually came up to me, and these are nurses, actually came up to me, hey, I started listening to your podcast. And I started at number 1, and I got to number 10, and I need to go back to it. And I keep saying to them, you know what? Don't go to number 1 unless number 1 interests you. Go to our webpage. Our webpage is completely searchable. You can search by who we've interviewed, the affiliation of that individual, what university, what association they have, or by topic. So I would recommend go to our webpage, reefermed.ca, find a topic that you're interested in, hit the topic, and you'll see that we may have 4 episodes on that topic. Then you can then go to Spotify if you want to take it for a walk and go to that individual episode. So I recommend you go to our webpage, find us there. You can watch us and listen to us there. And when you listen to one of these episodes, rate us. Tell people about us, because Meta, Facebook, Instagram, these social medias are not pushing us, except they keep asking me to boost stuff. You notice that, Trevor? I make a post to say, boost this for $100. Yeah. And I'm thinking,
well, I'm just going to completely disagree with Kirk there. I think everybody really should go back to episode 1 and listen to every single one of them. Hey, put a 5-star rating on every one, because, you know, you don't have anything better to do than go listen to an entire back catalog of Reefer Madness. Okay.
There's 157 episodes, my friend.
People have nothing else to do but listen to Reefer Madness. But yeah, in all seriousness, I think Kirk's done a great job on our website, sort of breaking it down by guest, breaking it down by topic, making it easy to find for the stuff you're interested in.
And all the research is there. Like, this paper will be attached to the website for that particular episode. So if you don't trust us, read the paper. Like, so yeah, guys, reefermed.ca. Enjoy our podcast. Tell a friend. We've been doing this for 7 years, 8 years now. We started this before legalization, and we have something to say. So spread the word. Help us spread the word.
It was another good one, guys. We'll talk to everybody later.
Cheers.
Check out the complete library of Reefer Madness episodes at reefermed.ca. And make sure to follow us on all the socials for bonus info on what Trevor and Kirk are up to.
Yeah, they were able to look at behaviors. It's sort of like that book they wrote about Donald Trump. There's a whole bunch of psychologists that got together and wrote a book about that. Donald Trump. This is during his first presidency. Okay, we'll cut that part out. Okay, never mind.